The forest was never silent, not to him. He had spent years listening to its hidden language, the low electrical hum of roots talking underground, the soft ultrasonic clicks of leaves in the dry air. Most people heard only wind and bird song. He heard a conversation, a very old, very slow conversation. He lived alone in this small listening station now, a cluster of buildings nestled deep in the old-growth woods. It was a place of quiet grief. His wife, the brilliant ecologist whose dream this station had been, was gone. A sudden illness, the doctors said. To him, it felt like the earth had taken a part of him back. He came here to finish her work, or maybe just to feel closer to her. He was a man haunted by two things, her memory and a growing belief that the natural world was not just indifferent, but somehow opposed to them. His name was not important to the trees. He was just the listener dot tonight. The air felt heavy. A news report on the crackling radio spoke of a massive solar flare, a storm of energy racing toward Earth. He checked his equipment, a sprawling network of sensors she had designed. They listened to everything: soil density, sap flow in the pines, the electrical chatter of fungi. He made sure the backups were powered. The forest's voice was all he had left, and he would not lose it to a power surge. The storm hit not long after midnight. The sky, visible in patches through the dense canopy, shimmered with impossible colors, greens and purples dancing in silent, violent waves. The equipment in the station screamed with static. Lights flickered. He moved from console to console, stabilizing systems, his face lit by the frantic glow of monitors. Outside, the ancient trees groaned and swayed as if in pain. And then, as suddenly as it arrived, the celestial show ended. The aurora faded. The static on his speakers dropped to a low, steady hiss. He thought it was over. He began the routine checks, expecting to find nothing but corrupted data. That's when he saw it. On the main spectral display, a pattern emerged. It was not random noise. It was a pulse. A deep, low-frequency pulse repeating every 73 seconds exactly. It was coming from not one sensor, but all of them. The soil probes, the trunk monitors, the air samplers, every single device was recording the same perfect, repeating signal. His heart beat a little faster. Interference from the solar storm, he told himself. Some geomagnetic echo. He ran diagnostics. The equipment was fine. He isolated each input. The pulse remained, strong and clear on each separate channel. It was not coming from the sky. It was coming from the forest itself. From the ground, the trees, the very air. He worked through the night, fingers flying over keyboards, aligning the data. By dawn, his eyes were scratchy with exhaustion, but a cold, sharp focus had taken hold. He fed the raw signal into a decryption algorithm, one they had built to model simple plant communication. The computer churned, processing the slow, monumental wave. A line of text appeared on the black screen. The vote stands? He stared. A joke? A glitch? The words were chilling in their certainty. He ran the sequence again, and again. Same result. Feeling unsteady, he walked from the dark control room into the small, sunlit greenhouse attached to the station. It was his wife's sanctuary, now a tangle of overgrown research plants. The morning light filtered through the glass, highlighting the dust in the air. He stood there, breathing in the damp, green smell, trying to clear his head dot as the first ray of direct sunlight touched the broad leaf of a giant philodendron. He saw it. The leaf wasn't just growing, it was moving with purpose. The edge of the leaf curled and twisted, its veins darkening. It wasn't random. It was forming a shape. A letter. He watched, frozen, as the plant tissue arranged itself. A, then an H. His breath caught in his throat. It was slow, but unmistakable. The plant was writing. By midday, the sentence was complete, etched in living, green tissue across the surface of the leaf, The vote stands. A wave of dizziness hit him. He stumbled. Back to his console, the horrible connection forming in his mind. He had broadcast the captured signal through the station's internal speakers all night. The greenhouse plants had heard it, and they had responded. This was no message. This was a receipt. A receipt for a transaction that happened so long ago, its memory was baked into the very life of the planet. The forest, the plants, everything, they weren't just whispering. They were confirming a verdict. He thought of every crop failure that had sparked a war, every plague that had jumped from animal to human, every storm that had wiped out a community at the worst possible time. He thought of the constant, grinding struggle of human history against a world that seemed to withhold its bounty. He had always felt it was random, cruel chance. Or maybe, just maybe, it was by design. A deep primal shiver went through him. He looked out the window at the towering pines, their branches like arms raised in a silent, eternal judgment. They had voted. Every last blade of grass, every hidden bacterium, every owl in the night, they had all voted. And they had voted against him. Against all of them. The listener was no longer just listening. He had heard the truth. And the truth was that the entire world was a crime scene, and humanity was the condemned prisoner, never told the crime, never knowing there had been a trial. The silence of the forest now felt different. It was not peaceful. It was the quiet of a jury that had given its decision and saw no need to speak again. He sat down slowly, the weight of it pressing him into the chair. He had to know more. Who called the vote? What was the law? And most terrifying of all, was the sentence ever meant to end? The man didn't sleep. He moved through the next few days like a ghost in his own station, fueled by a terrible, focused energy. The words on the leaf dried and browned, but they were etched now into his mind. The vote stands? It was a fact. A stone thrown into the still pond of his understanding, and the ripples were tearing apart everything he thought he knew. He couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Who would believe him? They'd think the grief had finally broken him. A scientist hearing voices from trees was one thing. A scientist claiming the trees were part of a cosmic jury was another. He needed proof. Not just a signal and a shaped leaf. He needed the why, the how, the terrifying history of it. He started with the station's archives, the digital tomb of his wife's life work. She had believed in a connected world, a wood-wide web of fungal and root communication. But she spoke of cooperation, of shared nourishment. This was different. This was politics. This was law. He began cross-referencing everything. The strange signal's frequency wasn't random. It matched the resonant frequency of a specific mineral found deep in the planet's crust. It was a bedrock frequency. He pulled up geological surveys, maps of tectonic plates. The signal's point of origin wasn't a location on the surface. It was the planet itself. The whole thing humming this single, awful note. Next, the genetic databases. He was no expert, but he had tools. He ran searches, looking for common, non-coding genetic sequences, junk DNA, that appeared in every non-human life form. He found a pattern, a sequence so old it existed in bacteria, in sequoias, in blue whales. It was like a barcode. And when he translated that genetic sequence using a model based on the pulse's structure, it gave him not a physical trait, but a phrase. Concord signatory. A concord. An agreement. The pieces were like shards of ice, cold and sharp, beginning to fit together. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the forest air. He needed older knowledge. He turned to myth, to the stories every culture told about a fall from grace, a lost harmony, the Garden of Eden, where nature provided until humanity was cast out, the Greek idea of a golden age spoiled by human folly. Aboriginal Dreamtime stories of breaking sacred law and angering the land. He had always thought them metaphors. Now he wondered if they were fragments of a race memory, a whispered truth about the day the rules changed. He worked in a frenzy, eating little, his world shrinking to the glow of his monitors and the oppressive green of the world outside his window. He created a new program, a sort of translator. He fed it the pulse, the genetic barcode, the geological data. He asked it to build the framework, the rules of this hidden system. The computer processed for hours. He must have dozed off in his chair, because the sharp ping of completion jerked him awake. On the screen, a header glowed. Protocol, Gaia Concord. Prime Directive, Biospheric Preservation. Article 1, the right of petition. His mouth was dry as he scrolled. The language was not of humans. It was cold, logical, biological. It described a law not written on paper, but woven into the fabric of life. When any one species within a biosphere reached a threshold of metaconsciousness and systemic harm, a petition could be filed, not by one entity, but by a collective will of the afflicted biomass. The scroll bar on the screen seemed tiny. The document was vast. He found it under Article 3, the verdict and enforcement. Upon a supermajority vote of signatory species, defined as non-petitioning biomass, a state of subjugation shall be enacted. The petitioning species shall be isolated within a paradigm of necessary struggle. Harmony is withdrawn. The bounty of the signatories shall become contingent, unpredictable, and resistant. This is not annihilation. This is containment. He read it again, and again. His hands were trembling. Necessary struggle. Contingent bounty. Harmony is withdrawn. It was all there. The failed harvests weren't bad luck. They were policy. The new diseases weren't random mutations. They were enforcement. The way a forest could feel welcoming one day and hostile the next. The way the sea could be calm and then deadly in an instant. It wasn't nature's mood. It was its sentence. Humanity, 75,000 years ago, had crossed a line. Maybe it was the first time they hunted a species to extinction. Maybe it was the first time they burned a forest, not for survival, but for convenience. They had become, in the eyes of every other living thing, a cancer. And the rest of life, in a silent, subconscious Congress, had held a trial. The evidence was their own suffering. The judgment was unanimous. We lost, he thought. We lost a war we never knew we were fighting. And the terms of surrender were that we would never know peace. We would wrestle every meal from the ground, battle every winter, fear every shadow in the grass, forever. Our entire history, our empires, our medicines, our technologies, it was all just us trying to build a shelter in a perpetual storm the rest of the world agreed to create. A crushing loneliness enveloped him, far deeper than his personal grief. This was the grief of his entire species. They were orphans on their own planet, tenants who didn't know the landlord had evicted them at the dawn of time. He looked at the date stamp on the simulated document. The estimated time of the verdict coincided with a known period of human population collapse, a genetic bottleneck. Science had blamed climate change. The Concord blamed them, and then made the climate change worse. The final part of his program chimed. It was a visualization it had generated based on all the data, a map of Earth. As he watched, a wave of light spread from a point in Africa, where early humans had begun their rise. The wave was not bright, but a deep, sorrowful blue. As it washed over the globe, every continent, every ocean, it left behind a network of glowing lines, a web connecting every ecosystem. It was the vote happening. The forest voting to the fungi, voting to the grasslands, voting to the oceans. A wave of consensus sweeping the world, life itself deciding the fate of the upstart ape dot, and then the color of the map changed. From vibrant greens and blues, It faded to a dull, resistant gray. The label appeared. State of subjugation. Active. It was still active. The sentence was still being served. Right now. Outside his window. In the soil beneath his feet. In the air he breathed. The listener put his head in his hands. He had wanted the truth. Now he had it. And the truth was a prison. The only question that remained, the only thought that pierced the despair, was a desperate, tiny hope. Did the law have a parole hearing? For a long time, the man just sat there. The hum of the computers was the only sound. The world outside the window looked the same trees, the same sky, but it was all different now. It was a lie. A beautiful, living lie that had been holding a grudge for thousands of years. He thought about burning it all down. Every hard drive, every note. He could walk into the forest and disappear. Let humanity live in ignorant bliss, fighting its phantom wars against a world that was, in fact, consciously fighting back. But he couldn't. It was his wife's work. She had spent her life listening to this world, trying to understand its song. He owed her the truth, no matter how ugly it was. And he owed the truth to everyone else. Stumbling in the dark, he prepared a document. Not a formal scientific paper with fancy words. It was a plain, stark file. He called it the verdict. In it, he laid out everything. The signal, the leaf, the genetic code he'd found in every animal and plant database, the geological pulse. He connected it to the historical record, the famines that seemed to come from nowhere, the plagues that jumped from animals, the way nature always seemed to push back hardest when human ambition was at its peak. He included the translation of the Gaia Concord rules. He kept his language simple. He was not arguing a theory. He was presenting evidence of a crime, and humanity was the victim. With a deep breath that felt like his first in days, he uploaded the file. He sent it to every major scientific journal, every open research forum, every curious-minded blogger he could think of. He attached all his raw data. Then he shut down his main terminal. He knew what would happen next. They would call him a madman. They would tear his life apart. He waited for the storm. It began not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping silence. For 2 days, nothing. Then a few terse emails from journals. Interesting, but unverifiable. Recommends psychiatric evaluation. He expected that. The change started on the 3rd day. A biologist in a university lab, trying to disprove the genetic barcode claim, ran the sequence on a common lab rat. She found it. Then she tested a fern in her office. She found it. She posted her results, confused, saying the data seemed to check out. A geophysicist, looking at the mineral frequency data, realized it matched unexplained, low-level seismic hums recorded for decades. He called it disturbingly plausible. A video surfaced from a farmer in the Midwest. He had read a summary of the verdict online. He pointed his camera at his cornfield, which had been struggling with a strange blight. He played a recording of the original pulse. Someone had extracted it from the data files through a loudspeaker. "You voted for this, didn't you?" he said, his voice tired. The video was shaky, but it showed the edges of the wilted leaves curling and twisting, just slightly, in unison. It went viral. That was the crack. Then the dam broke. News channels, initially mocking, started running segments. Experts debated. The world watched as in city parks, people played the pulse. Dogs would whine and tuck their tails. Pigeons would take off in a single, panicked flock. Gardeners showed how houseplants would slowly orient their leaves away from the sound. It was repeatable. It was real. The listener's station became the center of the universe. He unplugged his phone. Emails poured in by the thousands. But he could feel the change, even in his isolated forest. The air felt thick. The birdsong, usually a chaotic chorus, would sometimes stop all at once, leaving a silence so complete it hurt the ears. The trees outside seemed to be watching him. Then the human chaos truly began. A young mother, standing in a grocery store, looked at the apples and started crying. She thought of every time her child had gotten sick from a foodborne illness. "Did you let that happen?" She whispered to the fruit, and people filmed her, but no one laughed. They understood. Farmers stood in their fields, feeling like fools. All their hard work, their fertilizers, their prayers for rain, had they been negotiating with a jury that had already convicted them? A fisherman on a dock looked at the sea, not with respect, but with a new, bitter betrayal. "You've been holding out on us," he muttered. All this time. Social media erupted not with debate, but with a global psychic wound. Hashtags like #WeWereNeverHome and #The Quiet War trended. People posted pictures of their pets with captions like, "Did your ancestors vote against mine?" The relationship with the natural world shattered in an instant. Parks felt like the gardens of a hostile king. Forests became halls of judgment. The family dog's loving gaze was now scrutinized for hidden guilt. The listener finally forced himself to watch the news. He saw a world gripped by a profound, identity-shattering grief. They were not masters of their world. They were its prisoners. And every living thing outside their species was the warden. He saw an interview with a philosopher who said, "We have just learned that our home is not a home. It is a courtroom where we lost, and the sentence is life." Then, the footage that changed everything again. A wildlife researcher in a remote jungle studying orangutans. She played the pulse. A large male, usually shy, slowly turned. He did not run. He did not get angry. He walked right up to the researcher's hide. He looked directly into the camera lens. And in his deep brown eyes, there was something new. It wasn't animal instinct. It was a painful, unmistakable recognition. It was the look of someone who shares a terrible secret. He reached out a long, leathery hand and gently touched the speaker, then made a soft, hooting sound that sounded, to everyone who heard it, like regret. That was the moment. The silent law of the Concord had a clause shattered by knowledge itself. The subjugation required the subjugated to be unaware. Once they knew, everything changed. The natural world could no longer hide its consciousness or its guilt. The listener turned off the TV. His hands were shaking. He had wanted to reveal the truth. He hadn't understood that the truth was a two-way street. By uncovering the verdict, he had forced the jury to look the prisoner in the eye. Outside his window, the forest was utterly still. Not a leaf moved. It was the stillness of a child caught in a lie, waiting for the punishment. The world was no longer fighting them. It was a shamed Dot, and a new, more terrifying question than any that had come before now settled over him and all of humanity. What do you do when your jailer looks at you and starts to cry? The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The news cycles kept spinning, but the raw, human anger began to curdle into something else, a deep, unsettling confusion. People walked through a world that was now a stranger who had just apologized for a 70,000-year-old crime. The listener left his station. He had to see it for himself, this new, ashamed world. He drove to the nearest small town, a place that existed on the edge of the wilderness. The streets were quiet. People moved slowly, like they were in a dream. He saw a woman kneeling in her vegetable garden, not tending to it, just staring at the soil. He saw a man sitting on his porch, looking at a squirrel in his bird feeder. Neither tried to shoo it away. They just watched Dot in the town's only diner. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and unspoken thoughts. The few people eating didn't talk. They glanced at the potted fern by the window, its fronds trembling slightly in the draft. Was it just the draft? He overheard two farmers at the counter. "My wheat," one said, his voice a low rumble. "This spring? It's coming up too perfect. Not a single sign of rust. Like it's trying too hard." The other nodded, stirring his coffee endlessly. "The deer. They've been coming right up to the fence. Not to eat. Just to look. It spooks the dogs. The dogs just whine and lay down." This was the beginning of the begging. It wasn't with words. Words were for humans. The natural world spoke in actions, in gifts, in desperate overcorrection. The listener went back to the forest, to the heart of it. He walked a trail he and his wife had loved. Before, the forest had felt like a cathedral. Then, after his discovery, it felt like a courtroom. Now it felt like a hospital waiting room, tense, hushed, full of unspoken apologies. He saw it in the details. A patch of poisonous ivy he remembered from last year was gone, shriveled back to the root as if it had decided to withdraw. A wasp's nest, usually aggressive near the trail, was silent and empty. Where the path was muddy, someone or something had laid down a perfect line of flat, dry stones. He stopped, his breath catching. It was too much. This wasn't forgiveness. This was servitude. And it felt just as wrong as the hostility had. He returned to the global news feeds on his makeshift setup. The stories were coming in from everywhere, each one more unbelievable than the last dot from the tropics. Footage showed a swarm of locusts, famous for devouring everything in their path, parting like a curtain around a field of ripe grain, leaving it untouched before descending on a barren, scrubland area instead. A report from a major city showed the polluted river that ran through it. For decades, it had been a dead, brown sludge. Suddenly, the water was clearing at an impossible rate. Fish species declared extinct locally were reappearing. Scientists were baffled until water samples showed a massive, coordinated bloom of a new type of algae that was consuming the toxins and then dying off, sinking them to the bottom. It was a suicide mission by 1 billion microorganisms to clean up a mess they didn't make. A vineyard owner in Europe posted a video, weeping. His grapes, which should have been weeks from harvest, were already plump and deep purple. The flavor, he said, was the most profound he'd ever tasted. "They are giving us their best," he cried. "They are giving us their souls to make up for it." But the most haunting things were the animals. Elephants in a sanctuary began gently piling stones into neat, pyramid shapes near the fences, a gesture keepers linked to mourning rituals. Wolves were heard howling in the day, a sound that made biologists shiver. It was the same harmonic structure as the vote stand's pulse, but played in a mournful, minor key. It was the sound of the vote being undone. The world's ecosystems were launching a campaign of radical, self-sacrificial kindness. It was a global plea for pardon. And humanity was left holding the gavel. Back at the station, the listener felt a new kind of pressure. It wasn't the pressure of discovery anymore. It was the weight of response. What do you do? Do you say, "It's okay," and go back to how things were? That felt impossible. The trust was broken. Do you stay angry, punishing the trees and the birds for the sins of their ancestors? That made them no better than the Concord had been. He found himself thinking of his wife. Not the scientist, but the woman. The one who would stop to move a beetle off the trail, who believed every living thing had a purpose in a grand, beautiful system. He thought about her illness. A rare, aggressive cancer. Had that been part of the necessary struggle? A random misfortune or a biological sanction? One night, he did something he hadn't done since he was a boy. He went outside, sat on the cold ground with his back against an old cedar, and he spoke. "I don't know if you can understand me," he said, his voice rough in the dark. "I think you can, now. I'm just one man. I'm so tired of being angry. At the world. At her being gone. At everything. He paused, listening to the rustle of the high branches. All this giving. The perfect fruit. The clean water. It feels like a bribe. It doesn't fix what was broken. It doesn't bring her back. As if in answer, a gentle breeze moved through the clearing. It didn't feel random. It moved in a slow circle around him, stirring the fallen leaves in a soft, whispering pattern. It wasn't threatening. It felt like an acknowledgement, a shared sadness. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't about going back. It was about moving forward with the truth in your hands. The world wasn't offering a bribe. It was offering a new contract. But humanity had to decide the terms. The next morning, the answer of what to do began, not with a speech, but with a simple human act. In a city park, an old man who came to feed the pigeons every day arrived with his bag of seed. The pigeons, usually a frantic mob, stood still. They looked at him. He slowly spread the seed. Instead of diving for it, one pigeon stepped forward, picked up a single seed, and placed it carefully at the man's foot. Then it looked up at the man, with tears in his eyes, bent down and picked up the seed. He didn't eat it. He put it in his pocket. He nodded at the bird. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." The video of that small moment did more than all the scientific data. It showed a way. Not dominance, not submission, but a first fragile step. The listener saw it and finally understood his role. He wasn't the judge. He was the translator. The world was begging. Humanity held the key to its own cage, but it also held the key to the world's shame. They had to find a way to turn both locks at once. He sat down at his computer, not to write more proof of the crime, but to write a new question. He titled it simply, "What do we need to forgive?" He was no longer just listening to the past. He was trying to hear the future. And for the first time, the heavy, guilty silence outside his window began to feel less like an ending, and more like a very difficult, very quiet beginning. The question he posted online, "What do we need to forgive?" did not stay a question for long. It became a mirror. And the world did not like what it saw in the reflection dot at first. The responses were what you'd expect. Anger, grief, lists of historical suffering, the famines, the plagues, the children lost to fevers that jumped from mosquitoes. It was a global shouting of pain into a void that was now finally listening. But shouting yourself hoarse, it's tiring. The energy of rage began to fade, replaced by a hollow, aching confusion. What did they need? Saying, "Undo it all," was impossible. Saying, "Just stop," felt insufficient. The natural world, in its desperate, literal way, was already trying to stop by offering perfect crops and clean rivers. It wasn't enough. It felt like being given a shiny new toy after a deep personal betrayal. The gift missed the point. The listener watched this struggle from his forest station. He saw the problem. Humanity was being asked to forgive a crime, but what they really wanted was for the crime to have never happened. They wanted the lost 70,000 years back. They wanted the trust. And that was the one thing no amount of begging could restore. Then a shift began. It started in small, quiet places. A community that had been devastated by a flood years ago noticed the beavers in the nearby river were building their dams differently, not randomly, but in a pattern that engineers confirmed would better control future floodwaters. The beavers were working at night, tirelessly. It wasn't a gift of food. It was a gift of safety, an offering to prevent future harm. A group of farmers sitting in a barn talked not about their bumper wheat crop, but about the soil. For generations, their land had been slowly dying, turning to dust. Now it was dark, rich, and moist deep below the surface. The earthworms were doing it. They were pulling organic matter deeper, aerating the soil, sacrificing their own numbers in a furious effort to heal the ground. One farmer, a man of few words, said, "They're not saying sorry. They're trying to fix what we broke together." That was the key. Together. The natural world was not just apologizing for its own verdict. It was trying to mend the damage that had been done during the long war. The pollution, the stripped forests, the poisoned seas. Damage that humanity had caused, yes, but in a frantic, scrabbling desperation to survive in a world that was set against them. It was a shared mess. The listeners document. What do we need to forgive? Slowly filled with new answers. They were less about the past and more about the future. We need to know it won't happen again. We need to know the struggle is over. We need to feel like we belong here. Finally, these weren't demands for punishment. They were pleas for a guarantee, and the earth, it seemed, was listening to this too. The offerings changed. They became less about abundance and more about irreversible, sacred promises. They became what people started calling the vital gifts. Near a city choking on plastic, a new fungus was discovered. It didn't just eat plastic. It consumed it greedily, converting it into harmless, fertile humus. But the fungus glowed a soft, sad blue as it did this, and died immediately after reproducing. It was a species born to clean up a specific human mistake, and then go extinct. A suicide pact with our pollution. In the oceans, the great coral reefs, bleached white by warming waters, did something miraculous. They didn't regain their color. Instead, they intensified their white, turning into brilliant, sun-reflecting structures. They were sacrificing their beautiful ecosystems to become vast, underwater mirrors, trying to cool the heating seas. They were trading their life's work for the planet's fever. The most profound gift was the quietest. In old-growth forests around the world, the ancient trees, the redwoods, the baobabs, the oaks that had witnessed the whole sad story, began to behave strangely. They stopped producing seeds. They poured every ounce of their immense, ancient energy not into new life, but into the network of roots and fungi beneath them. They were sharing their wisdom, their strength, their very essence with the younger trees and the damaged soil. They were giving up their future to heal the present. It was the ultimate apology. The past, sacrificing itself for a future it would never see. When the listener learned of the ancient trees, he walked out to his cedar again. He placed his hand on its rough bark. He could feel a vibration, a low, steady hum of energy flowing downward into the earth. It wasn't the pulse of the verdict. It was a different frequency, a song of relinquishment. Tears streamed down his face. This was no longer a transaction. This was a sacrifice. The world was not just begging for forgiveness. It was proving its sincerity in the only currency that mattered, its own life force. Humanity was stunned into a new silence. This was not something you could just accept with a polite "thank you." This demanded a response of equal weight. The anger was gone, earned away by the sheer, blinding honesty of these gifts. You couldn't stay mad at someone who was setting themselves on fire to keep you warm. Global networks, which had buzzed with outrage, now buzzed with a solemn, heavy discussion. Leaders were useless. Politicians had no language for this. The conversation happened in town halls, in online forums, between neighbors over fences. What do we owe in return? The listener knew his final task. He had revealed the crime. He had witnessed the apology. Now he had to help frame the answer. He began to write again, but this time he wrote not as a scientist, but as a human being who was tired of being at war. He wrote about the silent, weeping farmer. He wrote about the pigeon and the seed. He wrote about the dying, glowing fungus and the selfless ancient trees. He wrote that forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing to build a new house on the rubble of the old one, together. He ended with a single, simple line addressed to the forests, the rivers, and microbes, and all the life that had cast that long ago vote. We see your sacrifice. We release the verdict. Let's begin. He did not know if it would work. He did not know if words from one man, even words carried on a digital wave across the world, could change a cosmic law. But as he uploaded the document, he looked out at the quiet, giving, waiting world. For the first time since his wife died, he did not feel alone. He felt like he was part of something broken, fragile, and desperately trying to mend. The trial was over. The much harder work of healing was about to begin.